Going back in time a decade ago, amongst the beefy giants of the gaming industry, there were two franchises that you couldn't overlook due to their popularity and attraction: Assassin's Creed and Far Cry. Ubisoft was already established as one of the biggest and most popular studios in the game. If I had to choose from a bunch, I think Rockstar Games, Naughty Dog, and Ubisoft were the big three of the industry. But back then Ubisoft was on top of the gaming industry. Assassin's Creed was on its peak, with Black Flag breaking Ubisoft's all-time sales numbers after a long 7-year campaign of prominent and successful entries in the franchise. Same goes for Far Cry. The third main installment is regarded as one of the best first-person shooter games of all time. From the unique settings and stunning visual presentations, it's safe to say Ubisoft knew what the fuck they were doing. Shamefully enough, it's all messed up now. The declining state of these two franchises, and let alone the whole fucking company, is painfully obvious. Once making some of the best games out there, which I so wholeheartedly loved, now making me not want to have to do anything with them. The story of Ubisoft's rise and downfall containing this golden age is one that I've been meaning to talk about for quite some time now. But this begs the question: how could these two franchises fall from grace so mind-numbingly hard? As you probably guessed, we're gonna take a look at the assassination of Ubisoft's Opuses. To fully get the scope of what I'm gonna be talking about in this video, we first need to take a look at two key things: Prince of Persia and Exile. Now you might wonder, what do these two things have to do in common with Assassin's Creed and Far Cry? And in the next few segments you'll understand what the connection is. Prince of Persia was the poster child of the earlier ages of Ubisoft, when they weren't quite the big money pulling company it was later going to become, but not one to overlook. Now, I think it's time for some nostalgia. Sands of Time was my favorite video game growing up, and quite frankly still my top 5 of all time. The technical scope this game left on my 6-year-old mind was very impactful. From the graphics to the gameplay to the combat that features some of the hardest enemies in my earlier gaming days, because I can't lie, these motherfuckers with them big ass swords genuinely had me terrified. The clever platforming, the unique story and setting, the atmosphere, even the sassy and arrogant yet charismatic prince.
I'll just ask the first sand creature I run into. Could you direct me to the baths, please? Well, thank you, don't mention it. I used to be a bath attendant back when I was alive.
This game had everything, even the soundtrack, featuring this rock style based music that it just makes combat sequences that much more aggressive and cinematic. Prince of Persia: Sands of Time was a success sales and reception wise. Being released only in mid-October, the game still sold over 2 million copies by the end of the year, which were good numbers back then. The only problem the game faced was the state's reach, so Ubisoft then decided to take a darker tone with the franchise for Warrior Within and the Two Thrones, which surprisingly didn't end up playing to their advantage in the long run. While the games were still great, sales and ratings started to gradually drop down after Sands of Time. Ubisoft then started working on a new game called Prince of Persia: Assassins, but they later scratched it, running with it and developing a whole new game. And in 2007, it would become known as Assassin's Creed. I'm sad this franchise ended up so rough, but one thing is certain: Prince of Persia walked so that Assassin's Creed could run. Now that we've established one connection, it's time for the second one. You might be wondering, what the fuck is Exile? Back in 1999, at an E3 presentation, Crytek showed their new engine called Exile, or Dinosaur Island. The display there showed technology that broke boundaries. Let me remind you, games still look like this. The PlayStation 2 wasn't even around yet, and Nvidia was so impressed by this display that they wanted to get their hands on it right away. But you know who else was being a bit of a peeping Tom? Ubisoft. They managed to strike a deal with Crytek, but Ubisoft didn't want a dinosaur game. Hell no, they wanted a bit more action involved. So the title being worked on by Crytek, Dinosaur Island, was cancelled and later remade into Far Cry. And to be honest, when looking back to the E3 2002 demo display at what Crytek and Ubisoft were cooking on, this was a step down in quality, with things such as level of detail being significantly reduced and gunplay that would simply want to make you rip your fucking heart out. With a mild disappointment in the showcase, Ubisoft took a hiatus, going silent for the next 2 years until the release of Far Cry in 2004. And to address the somewhat downgrade of the showcase, it's understandable. Crytek never made a game with the engine prior, so adding all of these new mechanics and features into a brand new AAA game was bound to come with some step downs. Regardless of the problems it might have showed, Far Cry was a success, selling well over 700,000 units in its first 4 months and 2.5 million in its lifetime, only to be outsold by the almighty Warrior Within, released the same year by Ubisoft themselves. Now, going up against this game was an instantly lost battle, even despite what it might have seemed like when I previously talked about Prince of Persia a few moments ago. This is massively influenced by the platforms they were being released on. Far Cry was only on PC, and as you might have known, back then consoles were miles ahead on top, and Prince of Persia Warrior Within was out for consoles too. To say the least, Far Cry is a very flawed game, with lots of ups and downs. The enemy AI is dumb as fucking rocks. Crytek really struggled to make the combat mechanics fluid and looked very visceral. First off, the enemies would be able to spot you miles out before their models were being spawned in, and just to add on top of the unreasoning bullet physics, once you got spotted by one enemy, all of the enemies spotted you. Far Cry displayed some of the highest leaps in production quality ever seen compared to what was being released before. But as we've come to understand later, gorgeous graphics aren't enough to make a good game really, and this started to be apparent later on in the franchise. But Far Cry didn't undergo those criticisms. When analyzing reviews at the time, this game was receiving ratings such as 8 and 9s, and even as high as 10 out of 10s, simply based on the graphics and the physics engine. To boost up sales for the game, Ubisoft wanted to port the game for the consoles, but the unfortunate thing was that Crytek decided to part ways with Ubisoft and instead sign a deal with EA to develop a new franchise called Crysis, which you might have heard of because a decade ago it was the best looking game out there. Besides this, you must have heard back in the day of the memes when a brand new generation of graphics cards were released. The main question was, but can it run Crysis? So now Ubisoft were left in the dark alongside their Cry engine, and suddenly porting the game for the consoles became a nightmare. First off, they acquired the rights for the Far Cry franchise in the engine, but porting a game that used an engine specifically to display the power of the Nvidia graphics cards to the max wasn't gonna go according to plan. 1 year later, in 2005, Ubisoft released the Far Cry version for the PC to the Xbox under the name Far Cry Instincts. Now you might wonder, why only for the Xbox? They couldn't fucking make a stable running version for the PS2, that's the reason why. Far Cry Instincts doesn't bring anything new to the table, suffering from the same flaws as its big brother. Enemy AI is even dumber somehow, now with their detection meter being dialed down so hard to the point where they can't even really spot you anymore. More dumb bullet physics, same shitty protagonist. The only difference is that now you got to play as a mutant with superpowers such as super speed and strength, mimicking Crysis. But one very big problem were the graphics. Pretty much any kind of identity that Far Cry had has been stripped away from it. Instincts, as you can tell, is not a good looking game. Not even for the platform, not even for the time. With lesser draw distances that really makes them hard to overlook. It did the job because one thing Ubisoft knew was one key thing back then, and that was capitalizing on hype. Instinct sold about 500,000 copies, but after making Far Cry Instinct's Evolution, which was even worse than this one, selling only shy of 100,000 units, it was considered a mild disappointment. And after that they had the brain-dead idea of making Far Cry Vengeance for the Wii. With that, I think only selling about 10,000 units. Safe to say the franchise wasn't in a good place by that time, but lucky for Ubisoft, the new generation of consoles, including the Xbox 360 and PS3, just released. Now that we got the come up explained, it's time to go back to 2007. This has to be one of the hardest hitting advertisements for a product ever seen in the gaming industry. Though, this just might be the height of the game. In a few departments, the base game falls flat. Being the first to go at this formula of Assassin's Creed makes it understandable to give it the benefit of the doubt. So let's quickly go over some basics. As I just said, this first installment falls flat, feeling quite stiff and limited at times. People that defend the game sometimes go over the enjoyment of a simpler game design and the nostalgia, and there is nothing wrong with that. It's the same case for me with Sands of Time. The arsenal consists of only 4 usable weapons: hidden blade, sword, throwing knives and daggers. Mechanics could often be boring and basic, not allowing for room for improvement. Enemy AI exhibits predictable behavior patterns and limited reactions, diminishing the depth and challenge of the combat encounters, and overall just makes for repetitiveness. Let's move on to the more appealing aspect. At the time, these mechanics were groundbreaking and on a much higher echelon of fellow parkour mechanics and such. While some people consider it slow and lacking polish, I think it's very effective for a first try. Yes, it got way better in Assassin's Creed 2, but it was bound to be expected being one of the core mechanics. It feels more deliberate than in other titles, being able to look at it as some sort of a puzzle, needing to dissect and look for climbing routes, compared to the more auto climbing that we got later on. Before ditching this, I personally think that they should have kept some of the parkour mechanics of Prince of Persia. It would have made for an even more complete set. I really want to mention this because I think this is where Ubisoft, even now, surprisingly still excel at. Based on the environments and vistas alone, the atmosphere feels very immersive. While in other games the showtime plays in a fictional world created by the devs, Ubisoft takes more of a historical approach, taking place in the Third Crusade in the Holy Lands, which is the modern-day Israel, Palestine and Syria area, in the year 1191. One of the major reasons why Ubisoft's worlds feel so immersive and beautiful, it's being teamed up with a level of graphical fidelity and detail. These two aspects that for the most part Ubisoft manages to indulge players into the experience with. Now before moving on, I want to address 2 more things: the story and the characters. Going back to it, Ubisoft somehow was able to make the essence of this great game, having this douchebag going back in time and becoming one of the best assassins of all time. How could they make it boring? They kinda did. Now when it comes to Altair, I know I'm gonna get some backlash from what I'm about to say, but whatever. Altair is one of the most boring protagonists in the whole franchise. The only memorable thing about him being that he's the first ever assassin on display, and also being held on high regards by Ezio and the lore. I mean, for fuck's sakes, not even Desmond seems to care about this shit sometimes.
Looks like... is that blood?
Assassin's Creed 1 sold well to the public, and was received rather highly by critics, and felt like Ubisoft has finally struck gold. In 2009, Ubisoft released what I consider to be the opus of the franchise. Besides improving on the combat, adding more animations and a bigger arsenal at your disposal, Mechanics were given a touch of improvements that felt a lot more satisfying, also with the addition of a second Wolverine hand and ranged combat. Now in this second entry of the franchise, Ubisoft improved the parkour and climbing mechanics, feeling a lot more fluid to partake in. The strong point of Assassin's Creed 1 were the world building and graphics, which oh my god, they nailed it out of the park again. The game takes place in Italy in the year 1476, spanning over quite a lot of fucking years. I can't even count anymore. Compared to his predecessor, the protagonist Ezio felt a lot more polished and well written, and a lot more charismatic overall, being the poster child of Ubisoft and regarded as one of the best protagonists in gaming. When you think about Ubisoft, Ezio is one of the first things that comes to mind. His story and character arc were on a much higher pedestal than Altair's, it's spanning over 3 separate games. But personally, I think in Brotherhood that's when his story should have ended, because by the finale of that game it was pretty apparent that his arc was pretty much wrapped up, with him being a full-grown adult and a fully experienced and matured assassin. And not to lose you over details, all I have to say is that, again, an improvement from Ubisoft with the game, and sales and ratings speak for both cases. While Revelations doesn't reach the heights of the earlier 2 games, the development story of it is quite interesting. In 2010, the Nintendo 3DS was popping off, so Ubisoft decides to make a game solely for that platform alone, called Assassin's Creed Lost Legacy. But due to development going wrong, this caused being a lack of performance available from the platform, it was crashed and remade into Ezio's last adventure, Assassin's Creed Revelations. This is why this game felt like a noticeable step down and linger on Ezio's story far too much in my opinion. It should have ended with Brotherhood, and sales and receptions show why it wasn't quite up to standards. Assassin's Creed 3 was released in 2012, set in the time of the American Revolution. The mechanics were vastly improved on, with the combat feeling like the ultimate formula of the Assassin's Creed by that point. More movesets, more aggressive combat, more weapons, because yeah, of course in this time and situation it's gonna be more of them, but the true core mechanics largely remain the same, with Ubisoft improving them with things such as climbing, where you could now parkour on trees like fucking Tarzan. Remember when I said Assassin's Creed 1 had a poor story and poor characters? Yeah, it's the same thing here. Nothing that makes you go wow too much. You start off with, oh my god, who the hell is this guy? Guess what? He's not the guy from the cover, and he ends up being a Templar. And after a few hours you finally get to play as Connor, kind of forgettable, and then you later find out that the Templar guy at the beginning is your dad, but you're an assassin, which makes you enemies? Wait, what? And then you end up murking him? Wait, what the fuck? It's quite the overall plot twist. In general, the main theme of O'Connor's arc is revenge. Oh, the Templars burned down my village, so now I gotta become an assassin and avenge my people, and kill my biological dad in the fucking process. As you can realize, the theme of revenge is the main drive for a lot of these protagonists in the franchise. Assassin's Creed 3, despite divided opinions on it, the game still outsold the rest, setting new records. Everybody's favorite pirate game, am I right? Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag is also regarded in the eyes of the fans as the actual opus of the franchise. Starting out as a pirate, then stealing clothes to become an assassin? What the fuck happened to, kind of going through the bloodline? You play as Edward Kenway, I'm pretty sure that's his name. Edward is by far the best protagonist in the franchise since Ezio. Very funny nature and loads of charisma, but a problem I guess I have with this game is that it's one of the worst assassin games, but one of the best for sure under the name Assassin's Creed. This is probably the greatest pirate game ever made, Regardless of anything, the game was received very well by fans and critics, and outselling all of the previous games. But one problem that seemed apparent is that the Ubisoft formula was not actually good. Like, for this game, about 70% of the fucking missions being tailing missions, stupid map markers that overpopulate the map and overwhelm the player, but more of that in the third chapter. After signing one last deal with Crytek in 2006, development for Far Cry 2 started. Far Cry 2, released in October of 2008, is an open-world sandbox compared to the linear games prior. By this time, companies like Rockstar and such had heavily popularized this game formula of being able to do whatever, whenever, wherever you want. And the wherever was one big appeal of Far Cry 2. Set in the motherland of Africa during a civil war, you play as a mercenary tasked with killing the Jackal, someone who's been supplying weapons for both sides of the war. Sadly, this chase of him ends up downright ugly for the players, as you get fucking malaria in the process.
That didn't work out the way they planned. I'm still breathing and you're the one with malaria.
So the plot in a nutshell is about the mercenary helping one of the two sides of the war in exchange of information on the Jackal's whereabouts. Now that we got the main plot out of the way, let's look over what Far Cry 2 has to offer. The second entry is heavily set on realism, for the better or for the worse. And when I say heavily, I mean that shit. In the newer Far Cry games, accessing the map would require you to open a menu. Now this game takes a different approach. This is the map, a full-blown paper map that you pull out of your pocket. Now when it comes to guns, this might just look cool at first, but trust me, it gets frustrating after some time. The weapon degradation system in this game will haunt you through your time playing Far Cry 2. Over time your weapons feel like they have some sort of a warranty because they just suddenly stop working, causing them to jam and lose accuracy. Now an obvious solution would be to just pick up the enemy weapons off the ground. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, but you'll be disappointment with a capital D, because these things are always in the poorest of conditions, returning you to the same previous problems that you were facing. In Far Cry 3, outposts would be liberated to alleviate some of the pressure from the ops in the area. Well, in 2, they just respawn every time. Compiled with this kind of shit, where you can't even take a breath to go to an objective because of it. The missions are extremely repetitive and feel like undercover side quests scattered all across the map, with you not even having fast travel as an option due to the limited bus stops on the map used for that need. And bro, what the fuck happened to the voice acting? NPCs talk like how you would usually read out in class.
They are paid to parachute in and grab someone.
He doesn't need to know who.
It's okay if he knows. They're here for a big shot from the APR, but if they take our enemy, we got nobody to fight.
Just get to the point.
The SF team is set up in good position in the desert, 2 kilometers to southeast.
I think that's a pretty accurate assumption because I do that all the time. The more underwhelming part is I mentioned the plot, where you fight for one of these two sides of the war. What makes it so bad is that if you decide to play both sides, the NPCs will tell you regardless something along the lines of, this is a secret operation, so even people from our side will still shoot you on sight.
Don't forget, this is secret mission, so you fellow guys don't know you. Don't expect any help out there.
Which feels like a major cop-out for creating any sort of plot consequence for playing both sides. Far Cry 2 is still, until this day, the most divided game in the franchise. Despite that, it sold rather well, head starting the development of Far Cry 3 instantly. I don't think I need to explain how iconic Far Cry 3 became, because I think you can already tell. So let's move on to the opus of the franchise, Far Cry 3. Building upon a lot of Far Cry 2's shortcomings, Far Cry 3, released in November of 2012, represents the true height of the franchise. Pretty much anything that you could have disliked in the previous game has been fixed, so let's talk about some changes. One of the most visible changes are the graphics, but what I really mean is pretty much the colors. Far Cry 2 presented a very bleak, desaturated set of colors that made the atmosphere very sad. I guess a better word for it would be grim. I don't know, man, I can't think of anything better right now. So in Far Cry 3 they fixed it, making everything such a bright green that it fights between being realistic and cartoonish. Enemies were tougher to see into, so they decided to just give them bright red shirts to spot them easier. As I mentioned, outpost liberations became quite a hit amongst fans of the third game, and enemies didn't respawn in these places like before. That's great. Also, you get a fast travel point, tagging system that allows you to track enemies from afar, even through walls. An addition of a variety of enemies like the heavies or these Molotov guys, I guess we'll call them the island suicide boys. I don't know what they're called. The variety of main missions in this game is so wide. For an example, in one mission you could be searching for an ancient knife, visiting some truly great environments that otherwise would be unreachable. And in one you could be burning down a wheat plantation with a flamethrower. And in another one you could be running into the best character the franchise has ever seen.
So they say to me, they say, Boss, who the fuck is it going to be? Them or me? Me or them?
This installment makes an effort to make main missions genuinely feel like main missions, not some side quest disguised as a main mission.
There's a special forces outfit in area just gone for.
A major step up in Far Cry 3's design was the story. While the core of the plot feels very hard to connect to, with a bunch of weird dialogues and moments, is the performances put up by other villains that really makes this shine. We all know Voss.
Did I ever tell you the definition of insanity?
He's one of the most iconic and popular villains in gaming. After all, he's the poster boy for a reason. But there's also guys like Hoyt,
Your very own island, for the head of Jason Brody.
Buck,
You are. I'll take your bloody if you like. I like my meat rare.
you know, Citra is not a dude and she's not quite a villain, but I have to mention her because we all know the reason why I should. But I think Jason is not a character to overlook. While yeah, he was outshined by these villains and other characters, I think his character arc was made up so nicely, pretty decently written, going from a scared rich kid to someone who is just as bad as Voss and Hoyt. Going through so many experiences with him can't help but make you feel for him and attach yourself to him. I mean, you've been there since his first kill. You can pretty much make it seem like you've been there ever since he learned how to walk. A problem Far Cry 3 faced was being released right at the end of a console generation and not being able to display the enchantments of the powerful Dunia engine, that being the renamed Cry engine, was able to show. When looking at the analysis of the console versions of the game back then, you could see frame drops way below 20. It's also not helped by the fact that you're presented beautiful tropical island vistas on the ground, but when you set up to be like Batman, I guess, you know, I mean using a paraglider, you get a tormenting popping mess in the sky, similarly looking to like Minecraft moments when the chunks wouldn't appear. I think you know what I mean. A lot of weird mosaic effects in the dark places that just look odd, outlines on the characters that I can't even explain what they look like. Now, if a game had these problems in 2024, it would be completely disregarded, but this is 2012. People tended to look away and be a lot more forgiving if the core game was fun. All of these things combined made Far Cry 3 the widely praised game we know today. Far Cry 3 sold well, but not that well. When comparing it to other Ubisoft games, it looks pretty underwhelming in comparison, selling over 4.5 million units in its first 3 months. Now, 4.5 is nothing to scoff at, but as I said, when other Ubisoft games like Just Dance 4 and Assassin's Creed 3 sold 8 million and 12 million in around the same time frame, you can't really look at it and not just say it's a little underwhelming. So what was Ubisoft's plan then? DLCs were popping off at that time, so this brings us to Far Cry Blood Dragon. Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon is well known for its futuristic setting, looking like what an 80s sci-fi movie would be portrayed as. Blood Dragon, released a few months after the main game, served as something different than expected. This DLC was not necessarily meant to be a sales hit, but more to keep the public's eyeballs on the franchise. To say the least, Blood Dragon feels and looks like a heavily modded Far Cry 3. Ubisoft knew what a big hit Outpost Liberations were in Far Cry 3, so they decided to just make this DLC Outpost Liberation Simulator. In regards as to what it brings from Far Cry 3, well, actually a lot of good. Many of the skill points that you would have to otherwise unlock are already available. You don't play as Jason Brody anymore, you play as a cyborg that can do everything Jason can, but just like 10 times better pretty much. In contrast to the setting, Ubisoft decided to make this world extremely foggy, but not only does this set it apart, it also hides a lot of its flaws. With the help of the fog, all of the popping mess visible is hidden, in addition of the players usually sprinting like in a 100-meter race, with not as much trees and vegetation that could just get in the way. You have unlimited sprint like before, which I think I forgot to mention. Yeah, Far Cry 3 has unlimited sprint. It's pretty hard to connect the Blood Dragon story because it never takes itself seriously for more than a minute, but the goofy nature never makes it for the worse, only adds to it. As I mentioned a moment ago, Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon did not sell that well, only shipping about 500,000 units, while the $15 you would have had to pay back at its release was totally worth it. The upside of it was the attention, making Far Cry 3 sales skyrocket once again, which was still a full price game by that point. This also helped to keep the momentum going until the release of Far Cry 4 in late 2014. The best thing you could say about Far Cry 4 is that it's more Far Cry 3. Ubisoft decided to not reinvent or change most of the things in Far Cry 4, and that is not a problem, because why fix something that was already working? Far Cry 3 definitely put a touch of DNA in other games. You could even see a not so obvious example in Dying Light. So if a lot of games try to be like Far Cry, why shouldn't Far Cry be more like Far Cry? Far Cry 4 consisted of only 32 missions. This means that it was much shorter than Far Cry 3. The reason why I bring this up is that the villains and characters don't get enough screen time for you to build any kind of resentment or love for them. Even in cases of Pagan Min, you don't get to see much of him, but at least the radar transmissions give more involvement for him, which I'm all for it.
I've been thinking about my image on the world stage, and I think what I lack is a celebrity endorsement. Pop star. If the dictator of Turkmenistan can get J-Lo to sing him happy birthday, then who's to say I can't get my fading star of yesteryear? Let's see how much Kanye is going for. Do you follow him on Twitter? It is gold. Oh, I would love to shoot the breeze with that young man.
But in the case of the other villains, you usually meet them once in a mission, and after that, in the second one, you usually take them out. Compare this to Far Cry 3, where Voss appeared on 6 different occasions, which I wish it was 10 at least, for the game to be able to build up that rivalry. Bug gets his fair share of screen time, and same goes for Hoyt. While only appearing 4 times, he's there from the start. In Far Cry 4, my problem is not that you only get too short of a story, but when it comes to siding with one of these two sides similar to Far Cry 2, there aren't any consequences. You quickly find out that these two knuckleheads might just be the bigger villains than Pagan Min, who surprisingly, after you causing so much distress to him, he still wants to talk things out, peacefully. As much as me or some other players would have wanted to side with Min, there isn't a solid option for that. Ubisoft implemented a secret early ending, where if you sit for about 10 minutes and wait for Min, the game actually ends.
Now we can finally shoot some goddamn guns.
And that's kinda the only option to side with him. This shady ending could be like this because this game barely had a 2-year development, so it couldn't get the touch it deserved. Far Cry 4 is very similar to 3, so I'm not gonna go over the rest because this video is getting pretty long. Far Cry 4 was a massive hit. Despite being released only 6 weeks before the end of the year, it sold 7 million copies, making it the 8th best-selling game of 2014, and finally beating Assassin's Creed in sales that year. But the question was, what will Ubisoft do next with Far Cry, considering the success it's been achieving? And this brings us into chapter 3, which is Ubisoft's game design is outdated. Thank you very much. Thank you for watching my video. That was about it.
Did I ever tell you what the definition of insanity is? Insanity is doing the exact same fucking thing over and over again, expecting shit to change. That is crazy.
Before I completely lose my shit and tear into these games, I want to talk a little bit about Far Cry 5. Far Cry 5 comes as a pleasant surprise in this time and age for Ubisoft, reinventing and changing quite a bit of the core gameplay designs for the franchise. Far Cry 5 is regarded as the last good Far Cry game, but I have a correction. It's probably the last good Ubisoft game. In the 5th main installment, Ubisoft decided to give a lot of freedom in tackling most of the story progression, and other games should take notice. Set in Hope County, which is the fictional setting based on Montana, USA, it does a good job into immersing you into this beautiful cult-infested place, feeling a lot like Montana, a place to which I've never been to. But a lot of people say it feels like the real thing, so I'll take their word for it. The reason I'm bringing this game into a positive light is because the freedom. Usually in Far Cry games you'd have to play the main missions to progress throughout the story, but in Far Cry 5 Ubisoft takes a different approach. Reputation plays a role into this, but let's establish the villains. There is the big bad Joseph Seed and 3 side villains, John, Jacob and Faith Seed. In order to confront Joseph at the end, you need to take down these 3. In order to take them down, you have to rack up resistance points. It can be through missions or open world activities, but the catch is you can just do outpost liberations and take down enemy convoys instead of playing the missions. So that means you can have fun and do whatever the fuck you want and still progress. This makes things like outpost liberations worth doing a lot more now. Before they were fun and you'd get an additional fast travel point, but now you can progress through the game by doing them. Same goes for eliminating big groups of cultists, same goes for freeing innocent bystanders, same goes for blowing whatever the fuck you want. There are even times when you could complete a main mission without even starting it. For example, there is this mission of taking out a statue of Joseph Seed, but you can just destroy it by shooting rockets out of it while being in the open world. But one problem is when you get over these stages of the resistance meter. You get captured by getting put down with a bliss bullet, and then you wake up in a bigger main missions containing the villain. At first, you might think this is cool, but after 6 or 7 tries, you kinda get bored of it. Also, there is no way to avoid this because no matter how hard you try to escape, the game will come up with some bullshit pretty much saying, nah, that's enough for now, we're gonna tell you what to do now. But if giving up 30 minutes of your playtime to complete some missions which are not even that bad, or sometimes are even great, in return for all this freedom, I say it's worth it. But now I wanna start my rant. And listen, I'm not a critic, so don't just take for granted anything that I'm saying here. This is just my personal opinion. I'm not a game critic. I don't really claim to be because I might not know what I'm talking about. Just my personal preference. I first want to talk about the irony and greediness that Ubisoft displays even in their trailers. When you poke your eyeballs at the one for Valhalla, this is what the critics have to say. But when you look at the way the audience feels, you'll quickly get confused. Look at Far Cry 6 reviews that Ubisoft wants you to see, and they really don't tell much truth, then graphics are good. Because let's keep it realistic, these games are not 10 out of 10s, these games are not 9 out of 10s, these games are not 8 out of 10s. Ubisoft is called by some people as the glorified 7 out of 10 game studio for a reason. We've essentially been playing Far Cry 3 since 2012. Only difference is some games do it right and some don't. Some come up with new and innovative ideas, some do not. But when you also look at Far Cry 6, and this is off script, I don't have anything written for this. When you look at Far Cry 6, it almost feels like 99% of the manpower that was supposed to go to making this game good really went to the chicken mini mode, because that's probably some of the best gameplay. A dog that has 2 legs and a fucking wheelchair? What's that? when that dog is the best character in the whole fucking game, maybe except for Castillo, which of course the reason being that you have Giancarlo Esposito. You will never have that guy make a bad appearance. Wait, what was I saying? Yeah, when you have the dog being the best character, there's definitely something going wrong. This Gus Fring lookalike doesn't even appear too much in the game because it almost ironically feels like just a cameo appearance that you just have 10 minutes of Giancarlo just speaking through the microphone from his phone.
I was acting. Or was I?
It's even a worse display of a villain than in Far Cry 4. Assassin's Creed has gotten its fair share of innovation, going from outdated mechanics to an RPG hack and slash simulator game. Now, before continuing, I just want to say, these games are not bad, but they are not 9 out of 10s. Critics make them up to be. The newer Assassin's Creed games featured this much different combat than the previous iterations, but the problem is this. You chip away at an enemy's health for long times with no response to the hitting that you're doing. And this might sound like a little disappointment, but dude, just put it all into perspective and just close it out. Assassin's Creed went through some innovation, but it just made the games just as outdated. They don't have anything really that interesting, and I guess at least they made the stealth part feel a lot more important in Mirage. Bad combat, bad story, bad characters, interesting settings, interesting ideas, but for every Assassin's Creed games that they make, they have about 100 ideas, 90 of them are shit, 10 of them are good. For Far Cry, we've essentially been playing Far Cry 3, and yeah, this is not the best game to date. This is not a masterpiece, as how some people say, not an 8, not a 9, not a 10. It's just using the same Far Cry 3 formula that it's just gonna fucking kill your excitement to play any Far Cry games, because it feels like Ubisoft is testing out the water so much, that meaning that they just try to make as bad of a Far Cry game until somebody notices. You can't just still do the same game with this ancient formula. You will end up with a game that it's, for the 95% of the times, boring. This game is so boring that Outpost Liberations are boring. It's so cringy. It's so boring again that it even made the grappling hook boring. You can't just slap a horse on Far Cry 3 and say it's a new Far Cry game, a new masterpiece or something, because you're essentially just having Far Cry 3 with horses, chickens, and more boredom. And I think I'm gonna end it there because I can't do any more of this shit. I'm trying to freestyle here, but there's just... I don't feel like I can reason anymore. So, thank you for watching my video, and I'll see you next time.
Did I ever tell you the definition of insanity?